Hey folks! Over the past 2 weeks I had the chance to thoroughly test the production version of the R5 Mark II. I spent the first days just charging the battery so I could drain it again for overheating tests. What I found out during these tests you will find out in this video. I'm David, you are watching The Vision, and let's roll the film. If you noticed that you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, subscribe and hit the bell, and feel free to check out my Instagram as well. Links to the R5 Mark II can be found in the video description down below. So, even though overheating cameras have been around before, the first Canon R5 was of course an epitome to a hot camera, considering the initial problems it had. And that's why it's definitely important for many of you who want to use this camera for both photos and videos to know how the R5 Mark II performs in this area. Unfortunately, the short preliminary test period in Munich didn't allow for overheating tests, so it was one of the first things I want to test directly. The R5 Mark II even got ventilation slots specifically for video and can be actively cooled via a battery grip with a fan. Unfortunately, I didn't have that grip with me, but it was mostly interesting for me what the camera can do with itself without active cooling. And let's just say the last 2 weeks haven't been kind to the camera temperature wise because it was very, very hot here. And it turned out to be more of a stress test. I tested everything with the camera's shutdown temperature setting to high. The standard shutdown temperature doesn't interest me much. And I can already say that unlike for example Nikon's Z6 III, the R5 Mark II never gets so hot that you could hurt yourself. So let's start with what works best and longest. And this basically turned out into a battery life test, even with the high ambient temperatures around here in my studio. While 8K RAW video in the real-time frame rates was a huge problem for the first R5. Here it ran smoothly until the battery ran out after 80 minutes. Yes, the battery was already drained after 80 minutes. But after all, that's 8K RAW video and it's a significant improvement over its predecessor camera. Similar to what I've tested with like Nikon's Z8. However, if you are not shooting in RAW but want 8K compressed as HEVC video, the whole thing unfortunately lasts significantly less time, because the processor needs more power to process the HEVC 8K video. But it's still longer than the first R5 here with 43 minutes. What's much more important to me, however, is the 4K fine mode, where the entire sensors read out, but the footage is downsampled or oversampled to create an extremely detailed 4K video. After a few firmware updates, the first generation Canon R5 had not so much issues with this. Expect when in case like this here, the ambient temperature was significantly high. The R5 Mark II managed this until the battery is drained. So 4K fine with HEVC or XAVCS codec, the battery runs out after 67 minutes. Slightly earlier than with 8K RAW. This is also very interesting. RAW recording is less demanding for the camera in this case than compressed recording with downsampling. This is because RAW video doesn't require the encoding into a video codec by the processor and doesn't require the downsampling by the processor. The camera writes the video data directly to the card without the intermediate step, which is why it lasts longer. This is also the case with the Nikon Z6 III, for example. It was a bit disappointing that the R5 Mark II doesn't support downsampling at 4K with 60 FPS like my R5C. However, the R5 Mark II can record 4K 60 FPS for quite a long time, and it looks much better than with the first R5. The battery drains and camera overheats simultaneously after 75 minutes of recording in 4K 60 FPS. With the old R5, recording time was limited to about 60 minutes before it overheated in cooler conditions. It's a similar story when using the interesting new SRAW video mode with 4K RAW video. Recording 4K 60 FPS RAW video in this mode gives you a runtime of about 70 minutes until the battery is drained and the camera overheats and shuts down. The mode is super interesting, but we will discuss this in another video about the R5 Mark II. And now let's move on to the more challenging categories for these cameras, such as 4K 120 FPS slow motion video. These look noticeably better in the R5 Mark II than in the first R5. However, the recording time is only about 18 minutes in these challenging environmental temperatures. It's just like before with the R5, but with the R5 I tested it in more cold environment. But for this frame rate, that it's not really a problem, because slow motion videos are usually in short clips, not full length films. For comparison, the Nikon Z8 managed about 30 minutes 4K 120, but also I tested this camera during the winter, not during the summer. Canon claimed a bit more recording time when it introduced the R5 Mark II, but they also tested it at 23 degrees, not 26 or 30 degrees like I did. So this is pretty extreme here. But that's what happens when your studio and office are in the attic of a house. What demands most from the camera is the 8K 60 FPS RAW mode. A new video mode that we've only seen in the R5C until now. But that camera requires an additional power source for this. With the R5 Mark II, it works without one, just not for very long. In my tests, the camera averaged about 15 minutes before it got too hot and shut down. The hottest part of the camera was by far the memory card. When you remove it, after the camera shuts down, it's over 70 degrees hot. I believe the biggest problem with this video mode is the sensor of the R5 Mark II. You might remember that the R5C doesn't have a stabilized IBIS sensor, and it has actively cooling. The sensor of the R5C can be cooled directly because it doesn't have IBIS. Whereas in the R5 Mark II, it's suspended and only connected to the housing for heat dissipation via flexible graphite connections. That's why it heats up so much during 8K 60 RAW recording. After shutting down, my thermal imaging camera showed that the sensor was over 60 degrees, which is quite significant. The fact that the sensor is the limiting factor here also explains why the 8K 60 RAW recording time can only be extended slightly with the active cooling grip, because the cooling doesn't come to the sensor itself, it comes to the processor. This is unfortunate, as the Nikon Z8 offers significantly more with about 55 minutes of 8K 60 recording time in RAW. Sure, it's also much larger, heavier, and as I mentioned, I tested it in the winter, not in the summer. I will go into more detail about the significant differences between those two otherwise very similar cameras in terms of video in another video. If you don't want to miss that, make sure to hit the bell. Until then, we can conclude that the R5 Mark II's video recording times are a significant improvement over the first R5, especially when it comes to 8K RAW video or 8K HEVC or 4K fine mode, but that isn't much different. 4K 60 FPS is noticeably better and 4K 120 is roughly the same. In practice, this issue only cropped up once in the 2 weeks I tested it. It was when I was filming my video on the Nikon Z6 III. I had to take a forced break after about 45 minutes, but it was extremely warm up here and the camera had already been running for a while for B-roll. Otherwise, I didn't experience any overheating issues with the camera in the past 2 weeks. Over the weekend, at the Photoloft, I shot a lot of sequences in 8K 60 RAW, in 4K 60 SRAW, in 4K 120 and had no problems at all. So this camera is not as reliable as an R5C for video, but the autofocus is much better, and we don't even need to talk about the R5C's battery life. But that's also a topic for another video. Today I wanted to bring up to speed on the overheating with the R5 Mark II. Let me know what you think about the results. Did you expect this? Did you expect better? Leave a comment down below or drop on the Discord server. Links to the R5 Mark II can be found under the video in the video description, and if you make a purchase through those links, you will be supporting this channel for free, helping me to continue making such videos. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and hit the bell if you don't want to miss any of my videos. And here are 2 more videos you can watch next. And that's it for me for today from Davision, and I say goodbye until next time.